Psychotechnologies Live. Welcome to a very special episode of Psychotechnologies Live. We've got with us Sean Blackwell, who's been researching and teaching about the spiritual dimension, healing potential bipolar since 2007. His link to his podcast is in the description. He wrote the book, Am I Bipolar Waking Up?, which I read, and I found it very, I felt very heard after listening to it. So that was interesting because I've never really felt, I don't know that I've like identified feeling heard from listening to a book. So that was fun. Sean, what is bipolar and how do we bring it so that everybody can have it?
so that everybody can have it? It's pretty easy. You just stay up all night for weeks at a time and just do a shitload of drugs, a lot of psychedelics, a lot of marijuana. And that'll pretty much get you there. You know, it's not that difficult. Pretty much, my opinion is that anybody can enter into an acute psychosis that could give you bipolar 1. So this idea that, we're dealing with this genetic issue has largely proven to be, not based in any sort of science. There's no research supporting that thesis, and like for someone like myself, I was the last person that anybody would have expected would have had a, acute psychosis. That was just never going to happen. But I had a number of triggers. I was in a self-help seminar that was very intense. I'd had a scuba diving accident 2 months before the self-help seminar, changed cities. I was changing jobs. And all that came together in this perfect storm, and boom, I had acute psychosis, and I thought I died. I thought I was being tested by God. I was going to be taken to heaven, but instead I took all my clothes off and peed on the floor of a hotel ballroom and on the carpeting and laid down in the pee and still thought I was being transported to heaven. But instead the ambulance came and they transported me to the hospital. I still thought it was I was being transported through the universe. Like I thought the hospital was a giant spaceship taking me to heaven or nirvana or something. But I recovered pretty quick and I got out within 4 days, So for me, it's like, if it could happen to me, it could happen to anybody. It's just a matter of the number of triggers and stressors going on and the amount of trauma in your life. And you put those things together, and it's a very easy thing to unfold for, pretty much anybody.
Okay, so like, let's say somebody does this, so they stay for weeks, and then they do a bunch of drugs, and start to lose touch with reality, have this psychosis, and then you're talking about like these experiences, and also like the ones you talk about in the book. Like I've had some of those through meditation and stuff, but not really like with other people as much. So like how does this it seemed very like live, like when we read the stories of like the Buddha or these other practitioners, and they're talking about like dealing with the gods or having these crazy experiences. It seemed like you were also like doing those things, just like at least at the beginning, was like not from a wisdom tradition, like you were just kind of just going through it on your own.
Right. And I had a little bit of education in, the wisdom tradition of particularly Buddhism, right? So one of the things that happens, and this happens when people do a lot of drugs too, is you lose a sense of a boundary between yourself and the rest of the universe, the rest of the world. And that comes with a collapse of the ego. All right. So you can have a drug-induced collapse of the ego, or it can come very naturally, and it can come through meditation as well. But I would describe it as like using drugs to collapse the ego is kind of like taking an egg and cracking it with a hammer, you might say. Whereas meditation is more like having that ego hatch. You're cracking the egg, but by hatching it, it comes in a more natural way, But then that feeling of oneness is there in acute psychosis and in meditative experiences, samadhi and things like that.
There's this saying that when you open the egg from the outside, it dies, but when it cracks from the inside, you have life. Like the chick is born and cracks its way out of the egg. which is
Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
a fascinating metaphor for like maybe growing up. When we choose our growth path, we get alive. When it gets thrown upon us, we sort of take it badly.
Yeah, and definitely when people are highly traumatized, for example, in their life, and there's a lot of drugs involved, it is much more difficult to go through the sort of acute psychosis experience that I had, and sort of work through the thing. It just becomes a lot more difficult, and that's where people end up medicated for life, and that's the majority of people. But there is, what I discovered in my work on YouTube is that there's just this huge gray area between these sort of very spiritual acute psychoses like I had that still got me arrested, still got me hospitalized, but it was easier to integrate. I got out of the hospital within 4 days. But then there's this other end of the spectrum where things can get very scary, potentially violent, a lot of paranoia, a lot of hallucinations. And it's a lot harder for people like that to work through their process. It gets a lot tougher. Most people are in that gray area in between.
Okay, you use the word integrate, and that sounds like the really exciting word for like someone's having some sort of from the outside, they seem to be doing very strange things. From the inside, they're believing something. And like, we want to apply the word integrate to that. What's going on? What's the integrate thing?
Okay. Part of integration anyways, and I think there's actually a few different types of ways to call things like integrating, but when you're in an acute psychosis, and I'm just going to use that term, it's a medical term. It's not exactly, I don't think it's exactly what that term means. Okay. But people will know you're in a non-ordinary state, right? And if you're going to integrate, you need to understand that there's something going on within you, even though it appears that something's going on around you. Okay. There's got to be a part of you that's recognizing that this is an internal process, and then recognizing that. And if you can do that and then sort of surrender to that process. So in the early days, in the 1980s, when you had like the Soteria clinics, their supporters, or they just had people there who volunteers who supported people through acute psychosis. That was it. They recognized that it was a natural healing of the psyche that was going on that people needed to be supported through. And so they would guide people into their own inner process, right? But if you don't have anybody there to guide you, most of the time you're going to project what's going on, and you're just going to fall into things and not recognize that you've really got to work through something there.
So is there like a rule here? Like, we can give people a clue? Like, if you're having a really bad time and you're looking at the world around you and you're like, everything's terrible, you can like, whoa, hold up, time out. Maybe there's something going on in here. Is that like a good clue for people?
Sure, that's a great clue for people. But even when people are not in a non-ordinary state, if you think in your life, in your just regular daily life, that everything is terrible and everybody is against you, hate to break it to you, but you're part of the problem. You've got to look at what you're doing, right? Your role on the whole thing.
I really like that, where you've got this like nice balance of like acknowledging like something is going on and it's potentially dangerous, while at the same time saying like, oh, we don't necessarily need to medicate it per se, and we don't need to, like force the person to stop. There's sort of like a natural way through it, which is, at least in part of recognizing that you're going through something and that you're experiencing this, and that you kind of like need to do this as like your own personal or spiritual journey, and it's your mind is like resetting itself or something.
Sure. But also you have to take that moment if people are in that acute psychosis sort of thing, which if it looks spiritual, you can support people through it, but you've got to take it very seriously, because people can think they can fly out windows from an apartment. They need 24-hour supervision from two people, right? So we just don't go, oh, this is a potential healing process, and just let people go. They need a lot of security. And that's why, I tried working with what I've referred to as the Soteria model of sort of being with people in acute psychosis. I tried that early in my work when I was making my first videos and I was volunteering and working with people. But then I found it too cumbersome because you've got an entire culture against you, entire culture that wants people medicated. And that's really tough to deal with, you know. So I started to take another path, and I don't really work in the Soteria model anymore, you know.
It's like your own model that you've been developing, or like in connection with, like I remember from your book you were in South America for a while, like doing the spiritual stuff from there.
Sure, I live in Brazil. I live
okay.
I live outside Sao Paulo, Brazil, in a tiny town called Vinhedo. But I was in Sao Paulo for a number of years. It's a city of 20 million people, you know. Yeah, and what I realized is that actually you can work with people on a spiritual dimension while they're medicated, you know, so that they're grounded and they're easier to work with. And you can just do some very intense work with them. So I had what I called the Bipolar Awakenings Healing Retreat that I started in 2013. And that's where I started to work with people who actually had a history of like maybe 5 or 10 year history of bipolar disorder and were looking to heal, you know. So that wasn't just about being with people, it was taking them into some very deep somatic techniques. And that's where I went from there. Yeah. But we might be getting ahead of ourselves. I don't know.
So I'm a map nerd. I collect all sorts of like meditative maps and spiritual paths. What is your major model? What is the way in which you're seeing this journey making for a client of yours?
Well, when people are going into non-ordinary states, right? The only doctor who's really laid it all out is Dr. Stanislav Grof. He's a Czech psychiatrist who was one of the founders of transpersonal psychology. And he has this extraordinarily expansive cartography of the psyche, you know, which really looks at every individual like we are just a little representation of the universe, and that actually our psyche, at the edges of our psyche, we're just all part of the same matrix, you know. So for him, for example, psychic kind of experiences, which science completely denies, but from Grof's work, you know, psychic experiences would be absolutely explained, and you can understand them and actually expect them, you know.
Because of the connection of the universe that we're living in.
Yeah, I mean, there's you know, you guys are probably familiar with quantum physics, a little bit of quantum physics, you know. So there's like our Newtonian physics world where, you know, we've got time and space, and, you know, we have to get on airplanes to meet each other and the whole thing when you're in Australia and I'm in Brazil. But there's this whole quantum dimension under everything that is beyond time and space. You know, there is no time and space. And so you can actually, you know, connect with people on that dimension. And the actual healing that needs to take place when you work with someone with bipolar disorder is happening in that quantum dimension. So this whole thing about psychiatrists looking at our biology and trying to measure it with PET scans and MRIs, which is always a failure, that's going to be a failure forever. They're never going to find the roots of our disorders because the roots of the disorder are in that quantum dimension. I mean, Stan Grof calls it a holotropic dimension.
Eliot loves holotropic breathwork. He brings it up every episode, whether it's relevant or not.
Oh, really?
I guess I take an individualistic path. Like anyone can try out a meditative method, a holotropic method. I did a facilitated holotropic breathwork session once, and before and after that, I was doing my own holotropic breathwork experiences. Like I'm some sort of cowboy. I'm like wild, right into the dark and see where you go, and have consistently found incredibly positive returns from spiritual experience that comes from meditative and altered states.
Cool. Well, and to give you a little background too for holotropic breathwork, you know, I'm a certified Grof transpersonal trained holotropic breathwork facilitator. Okay, and that's a pretty intensive training program because it's 9 weeks, which have to take place over a minimum of 2 years. All right, plus you've got to do, and these are week-long modules where you do breathwork yourself, plus you're learning the ins and outs of the theory, and then you've got to do another 100. Well, each breathwork session counts as like 15 hours. Okay, from beginning until end of holotropic breathwork, because you've got an orientation, you're going to do your breathwork, which is a 3-hour thing. You're going to have to be a sitter for somebody else. Okay, so you're having the experience of sitting and supporting people, and there's going to be a sharing process. So a full holotropic breathwork day is like 15 hours, right? And then you need to have like 150 hours of holotropic breathwork personal experience, in addition to what you get on the modules, to be certified as a facilitator. Okay, so you've got to have a lot of experience there. And Stan Grof and the Grof Transpersonal Training, which is actually a separate company, were very adamant about telling people, look, you shouldn't be working with people who are not Grof certified as facilitators, like the people who facilitate, because there's no guarantee of who you're going to be working with, you know. So lots of people say, oh, I've done breath work and this kind of thing. And then you talk to them and it's like, they may have put themselves into a completely dangerous situation. But if they think they've had holotropic breath work, usually they haven't, right? And so that's a little bit of a tricky thing. But what I'm learning online from guys like you, Eliot, is, you know, part of the branding of holotropic breathwork was to minimize the risk for people, because it can be a very powerful experience. Okay, and it could also lead to injury if you're not prepared and you don't have a good facilitator with you, right? But the thing is, there's a lot of people out there who are willing to take risks for their own healing for free, you know, and like, oh, I'll just try this at home and see what happens, you know.
Yeah.
and I found that sometimes people do find their own ways, just stumbling around. And so I read a book 15 years ago about a woman who was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and then she found that if she just let herself drop and just had seizures whenever they came, just sort of lay on the ground and start shaking, that she was getting better. And so she just allowed herself to do that wherever she was. Even if she was on the street, she would just drop and start to shake, you know. And at least by the end of the book, she claimed to have healed her schizophrenia. And I have no doubt that it helped her improve, because she was working through something there that made sense from a breathwork standpoint, right?
Yeah.
Wow. So I'm curious. Well, I think we need to start looking, like we sort of have to take the genie out of the bottle. We got to take holotropic breathwork out of the training and start to see what people can do with it in different settings, and let them know the risks involved and see where it takes us. You know?
What does that look like?
I don't know. I'm looking at building a training course probably for next year, where I'm thinking about laying out different techniques for people who are prepared to take on different intensities, and letting them know the risks involved along the way, and letting them know how certain people in their lives can be trained to help them to keep them protected and things like this. And sort of laying out a training guidebook is something I'd like to have done by 2024, at least, maybe earlier. But it's a bit of a daunting challenge, because you've got healing techniques, I think, that will be beneficial and low risks, but they're not going to be particularly powerful, you know. And then you've got these higher risk modalities that you can go into, where you might have a huge breakthrough, or you might break your hand, you know, or get hit by a car because you projected the experience and you didn't have the right people with you, you know. And even if you did, it still might happen, you know. That's the risk, right? So you got to be careful.
Let me give an example. So as a technique, if you want to work through some anger stuff, I will sometimes tell people, hey, go walk down to the ocean where there are loud waves, maybe at night where there aren't houses around, and just yell. Make a lot of loud noise. Make sure it like reverberates through your chest. Yell as loud as you can for like 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes. Just like really like activate the body in that way and explore your relationship to your ability to like really genuinely roar with energy. And this is a technique.
Okay.
Like it's on the upward side of things. It's like it's causing the workup of energy, and then you get to the end and like stop yelling, and then you have this like cool down moment.
Sure.
But this is a technique that's relatively harmless if you're doing it alone or privately. Kind of weird if you do it in front of other people or in society, or where we live in a world where you can't just do that in your backyard. Your neighbors will think you're weird. But
and I know down in Australia, you do have some beaches that aren't particularly crowded, right?
At nighttime, it's perfectly fine time to do it.
Yeah. The only thing is, I agree with your idea about the yelling, but I don't think the beach is a particularly safe place to do that work. If it were me, I would suggest people do it in their bedroom. And if they want to scream into their pillow and let people who could hear know what's going on.
Right.
You know, and that way you're protected. Because if you find yourself in a non-ordinary state at the beach, because the screaming can take you into a non-ordinary state. Okay. And then you could end up collapsing in the water and drown. Okay. So that's something you need to think about. You don't want people drowning, you know, this kind of thing. Yeah. And the other part is they might flip out into a non-ordinary state. You're in a public place, you might get arrested, you know, because it might take you into a space. And I would suggest too, it's better to do with a supporter who knows what you're doing, you know. But I think I agree.
Asthma. Like with yelling for 5 minutes straight, you can trigger irritation in your lungs, you can trigger asthma, you can trigger all sorts of
I have asthma. I wouldn't worry about asthma too much, but I just don't think it's the safest place to do therapeutic work. You know, my wife and I were watching a show about intensive self-help retreat, right? And it was happening in this beautiful hotel on the Mediterranean, and they're doing all these outdoor exercises overlooking the water, and it's very beautiful. And my wife and I just keep going, that's not a safe setting. That's not safe. This is totally dangerous what they're doing right there. You know, so you got to have a safe, protected environment. And then here's the other part is the healing is actually not coming from your yelling necessarily. It's coming from a higher intelligence. It's the healing field that is really bringing this stuff up. Okay. So if you've got this healing field, the healing field knows where you are and knows what's going on. And so if you're in a safe spot, right, and you've got somebody who knows what they're doing with you, then the healing field knows, and you'll probably have a more beneficial experience. You know, that's the other part of it. Although yelling, I mean, it's good to yell.
It's a specific technique for a specific anger, specific, like, you know, power moving through the body. Like if you have I mean, I'm starting to read traditional Chinese medicine, which talks about meridians and like pathways through the body and chakras. And like to really yell, you got to get your throat clear. You got to get your lungs clear. It's got to come from like deep in the belly. And like it can really align the body. You say safe setting, right? And I have a sense you really know what you mean by safe setting. What do you mean by safe setting for personal for healing work?
And there's different degrees to this whole thing, but it should be a place, ideally, and we rarely get ideal, but ideally a place where you can scream your head off and nobody's going to call the police on you, right? Should be a mattress, preferably on the floor, right? Some protection for the head against the walls, so if people head for a wall and they don't bang their head. And then take out all the objects out of the room, like everything. You know, you should think about a bathroom being nearby and restrict access to the kitchen, for example, where there's a lot of sharp objects and stuff like that. Like, I think that should be taken into consideration, you know? So I've done retreats with people in their homes, and typically they'll have like a living room or a bedroom that we'll work in. And I'll work with people on top of a bed. I've done that, but I prefer it on the floor. And I'll take any objects out of the room, you know. So it's like we'll have a holotropic breathwork session on the weekend in my house here on Saturday. And like we have a fireplace, right? So the first thing that has to be taken out is the firewood and like the poker irons and all that stuff. I mean, you can't have that near a person with doing a holotropic breathwork, right?
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like the way you're describing it, it's like you're almost like triggering like an episode, but like on a very small level in a controlled environment. And then you're like kind of letting that play out, getting the person used to it, and doing whatever is, like whatever I guess you're calling it the energy field wants the person to do.
Right. The energy field.
I would have said subconscious, but yeah.
Will bring the experience. Yeah. Yeah. The thing, I guess the difference is, I mean, the energy is from the unconscious or subconscious, right? Those are kind of synonyms, right? Unconscious, subconscious.
There's a technical difference, but we can.
Okay.
I'm sure someone is clear on the difference, but a lot of people seem to overlap them anyway.
I don't think I am, but that's okay. But what people miss is they tend to think of the unconscious or subconscious as kind of passive. They don't understand that there's an intelligence back there that can take things that are unconscious and make them conscious, or give you particular experiences that can work through what seems to be like the chakra system that could be like extremely powerful, and people do not expect that from breathing. A lot of people come out of holotropic breathwork sessions quite shocked, if they have the capacity to take on stuff,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like that itself, I think it's like that shock you're talking about where they're just like la 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 la, and then they're like, oh my god, like my subconscious exists and it's like tells me things, and now holy shit, like that is like that is awakening, right? Like that is what people try to do when they sit and meditate, at the beginning, or they take psychedelics.
Try to get more aware of their own mind.
It is different. It's usually a lot less visual than psychedelics, although visions can come. It's more of the body. It's more somatic, and it's very emotional. Whereas when you're meditating, the focus tends to be on peace and letting everything go. But in holotropic breathwork, you can have those moments, but the intention is more to get in touch with material that's surfacing, good, bad, or ugly, and work with it in a controlled environment.
Okay, so you've described like safe setting, right? So we have this room with a mattress, floor, nothing else, toilet nearby in case we need to go to the toilet, and then we're going to dangerous places in the safe setting, dangerous places.
Yeah, pretty much. That's a good way to look at it. Somewhat potentially, I wouldn't say dangerous, but potentially dangerous places. So you've got to be aware of what's going on. And then the other part of it, I guess, from what Daniel was talking about is, so you've got the safe setting, and then you have a proper mindset. So if a person has a good orientation, they know what they're doing, and they know why they're there, then they tend to have a good experience. If the experience, if they don't have the right mindset, for example, if they don't really trust the facilitator, or if people are on retreat and they don't really trust me, that's a long week. There has to be trust there with the facilitator. But like I've done introductory workshops with psychologists, for example, and psychologists, they've got a lot of training in getting in touch with themselves. They've got a lot of training in different therapies and things like this. When you put psychologists into their first holotropic breathwork workshop, they come out completely floored. They had no idea a lot of the time what was going to happen to them, and it's extremely powerful. Why? Because they're prepared. They've got the right mindset from years of training, right? When I've worked with people with bipolar disorder, for example, usually they don't have any training in psychology. They don't have much knowledge of spirituality. They just know they've had a spiritual experience, from their episodes. And their sessions actually usually start out quite quiet. Like, there'll be a number of quiet sessions before we start to get into more intense work. And you might even wonder, well, what do we have a safe setting for anyways? This guy hasn't moved for an hour.
Yeah.
It's incredible. It's like I see the dimension between like book smarts and street smarts, where the bipolar clients have the street smarts. Like this is what the classic, I think Mike Tyson line: "Everyone has a plan until they get hit in the face." Like the bipolar people have been hit in the face a couple times. They know how this is going. The psychologists have the big plan, and then they get hit in the face. And like, oh, like that, boom. This is what it's like to hit in the face.
Yeah. And funny enough, that maybe to that, I mean, there's not a lot of activity that happens with people with bipolar when they start out with the work, but they go into non-ordinary states very easily. So like it's just that deeper work needs to happen before they start to really express themselves on the mat. Because the disorder sort of numbs them on the inside. People think of bipolar as these really emotional people. That's really not what's going on. In their daily life, they're kind of numb, and they learned not to express themselves, and they hold a lot of physical tension. And so these things need to be worked through. The numbness needs to be worked through in breath work before you get to the more emotional material.
Interesting. That's fascinating. That's like, I'm like, wow, okay. You've got some insights into the shape of the condition. Like I was thinking for a moment, like the bipolar, the people who are familiar with bipolar have a lot of doors open to not ordinary states. They're just more open to it. They're more used to it. They've been there before. And like you've called it.
That's true. That's true.
Like familiar and numb is actually very close together. Like familiar in a good way, familiar in a good way, numb in a bad way. Like,
yeah. It's a little bit difficult to explain, because what you see is people go into these states very quickly, but they just don't move around very much, because there's a thing that happens. Like you've got a bioenergetic system, like a chakra system. And it seems like, I'm just looking at this from the outside, right? Because I'm in the room with them. A lot of people with bipolar disorder, they kind of have to have that bioenergetic system reconnected or rebuilt in some way. And when that rebuilding process is happening, when they come back, they talk about going into kind of a shamanic sleep where there's an awareness that they're not in their body, but they're not asleep. Like it seems like sleep, but there's an awareness. And then when they come back from those experiences, usually they're like totally unmoved for like 30 minutes. And then you'll see them go. And then you're like, oh, they're back. It's like, oh, they're back in their body. So like the healing field is taking people, it looks like the healing field takes people kind of out of their body to do a little bit of work, right? And sometimes they talk about the Kundalini energies happening in that moment, like hot energies, cold energies kind of going through. Then once they've had enough of that work happening, then they start to move around, So they go into this state very easily, like, because a typical person, if they're doing holotropic breath work for the first time, might be breathing aggressively in a safe setting for like 20 minutes or something, and thinking nothing's happening. And then all of a sudden, after 20 minutes, you're gone. But with most of my clients with bipolar disorder, they're gone within 3 or 4 minutes. And so the access is very easy. But it takes them a while to start to express themselves and have emotions come up and memories come up and things like that. Yeah.
Fascinating. I'm like, so is your main modality then holotropic breath work when you work with people, or breathing?
Well, holotropic breath work is like a formatted thing and we've been talking about it. It's like a 3-hour session in a group setting. And because it's a group setting with a limited time frame, it hasn't been recommended for people. It's contraindicated, like not recommended, because a person with bipolar could, or other deeper disorder, could have something really explosive come up where they need more support. And so that's why in 2013, I started this Bipolar Awakenings Healing Retreat, which had me working with one person for 10 days straight. And then we would do what I called bipolar breath work, like a modified version of holotropic breath work. And the big thing with bipolar breath work was it gave me more flexibility. I didn't have to deal with this sort of trademark thing. I could just do whatever I wanted. And usually that led to clients stopping the sessions earlier than the typical 3 hours, they would usually stop the sessions between like 45 minutes and 90 minutes, and we would come back to it every day, And when I tell certified holotropic breathwork facilitators that I'm working with people with bipolar disorder who are not recommended to do this technique, right? And I'm doing it with them every day for 10 days, they are floored. Their jaws drop. They can't believe it because they're afraid the technique is going to take people into psychosis, but it doesn't. It helps make them more grounded for the most part. If the trust isn't there and there's an issue, people can project and you got to kind of steer them back. The projection looks like a bit of a mini psychosis, but you can talk people back. And I've done over 50 retreats and I haven't had to hospitalize anybody. So I was really proud of that I've done that many retreats and never had to hospitalize somebody.
Good job.
Thank you.
Yeah. I imagine like the holotropic is like it's contraindicated because they're getting into these states, and then if the facilitator's panicking, then you kind of reverberate with this like high energy that kind of spirals out of control. But like for you, when you've had
it's not well. Hang on, I don't think the facilitator is going to panic, but the facilitator also has to be there for another probably, at least 6, probably at the most 6 other people who are breathing as well. And so they can't, in a group setting, they can't dedicate all their time to this one person. That's the issue. That's the issue. Okay.
So it's like a very like intense focus session, and then when the person is going through the stuff, you're able to like give them your full attention to.
Right. That's how I do it. Yeah.
Sort of guide them.
Yeah, my clients, it's when I work with people, it's a one-on-one retreat, and they bring a voluntary supporter who is often part of the process too. And it's just us doing this breath work, yeah. And so that's where it starts anyway. So they've got somebody dedicated with them who knows what they're doing, and that's important.
It's something I'm trying to understand. If someone goes maybe upwards, and upwards is a hard direction to describe, but towards excitement, towards mania, towards above mania would probably be psychosis. Do you go with them as the facilitator? Like, do you ride the wave with them and go like, let's get excited together? Or do you stay where you are and be like, hey, slow down, come back to ground? Like, how do you work with someone as they move up into that upward state?
I've only really had one situation where we had a guy like that, and it was really in the beginning of the work, and it did seem like breath work took him into a bit of a mania, but that was like in 2008, and he did not have the proper mindset going into the work. Okay, he had a pretty deep disorder and we were just flying by the seat of our pants back then. It was 14 years ago.
Experimental times.
Yeah. We're just trying to figure things out. We didn't know what the hell we were doing. I didn't even have my training at that time. We had taken him to a holotropic breathwork facilitator who was open to work with us, and it was actually my own. I was breathing as well at that point. We had this other facilitator to help him. But he did sort of go into a mania, and it's more the soteria thing. You just sort of ride the wave. You don't go into the mania and celebrate it with them. You don't try and control the situation. You just bring a attentive presence as best you can. You just stay with the person. You try and respond to their needs. You keep them protected. If they ask you to do certain things, you might want to participate, but if they're asking you to do something you're uncomfortable with, you just tell them, So I had one client who asked me to take all my clothes off. My wife and I were working with him, and he had gotten completely naked, and he asked us to take all our clothes off too. And I said to him, David, I'm not that comfortable with that. He said, oh, okay. But he spent the whole day naked. He was naked. Have I mentioned that enough?
It's a
running around a tennis court, and then finally he stops at these plants and he starts to eat the leaves on the plants. And I was like, David, what are you doing? And he says, well, dogs, when they want to purify their stomachs, they eat plants. So I'm eating these leaves to purify myself. I said, okay, just let him go.
This is very soteria, just kind of like, he's not actually self-eating some plants. That's
just
fine.
roll with it.
A bit
Just
odd,
roll
but
with it.
okay.
Yeah. And he was one of the guys we actually started with doing breath work kind of thing with, this kind of thing, because he was in an acute psychosis and we had him breathe while he was in the acute psychosis. And again, like he was gone, he just was gone for so long. And I actually got scared. I didn't know what I was doing at the time. And I had to roll this guy because he stopped breathing. He just stopped breathing. He was just like, and then that was it for like over a minute. And I had to roll him on his side. He was a big guy. And I started hitting him on the back to get him to breathe again because I was worried he was going to suffocate. But again, this was 2018 when I had 2008 when I had no idea what I was doing. But we got that guy, even with our minimal knowledge at that time, this was a guy who was hallucinating. My face was turning into Kevin Spacey, of all people, and after 48 hours with us, he had stopped hallucinating, so we were like, whoa, this was amazing,
2008 was like before Wim Hof with the like breathe and then go into ice baths and then just hold your breath for like 2-3 minutes. Like now that's a bit more common knowledge that it's possible to do the Wim Hof stuff. You can just do a lot of breathing and then hold your breath and then drop into ice baths and just go for it. But back in 2008, that wasn't so common.
Sure. And I do Wim Hof breathing too. I've got the training for Wim Hof breathing, not as a facilitator or anything, but as a practitioner or somebody who practices it, but the orientation is very different. There is a little bit of overlap, but, Wim's stuff is about reducing inflammation, which is a whole different thing. Although it has led to me laughing hysterically and crying. I cried in a cold shower once. So his work can bring up the emotions. I still, even though I know both techniques, I'm really a little bit unclear about how they relate to each other, except that Wim Hof stuff doesn't relate to releasing trauma in a focused way, Yeah.
Interesting. Because I've always had this curiosity of like, we're talking major breath techniques. The techniques are only like do a breathing in a certain way. And you've got holotropic and you've got Wim Hof. They've got a similar like breathe very quickly pattern to them. But how are they're obviously trying to do very different things.
Yeah. And they do different things. And Wim's is more like, Wim's breathing method is an exercise. You breathe in, belly. What does he say? Belly, chest, head. You hear him on his videos and stuff. He just talks about breathing from the belly and then bringing up into the head and out. And, inhale, exhale. It's very aggressive, and then it's like 30 rounds or 30 to 40 rounds. And then there's a big breath hold and you hold it for like as long as you can. And because you're doing your accelerated breathing, you could probably hold your breath for like 2 minutes or something like that. It's longer than the typical minute that we would have, right? But the whole point is to be reducing inflammation in the body. That's the focus. And so he's got scientific research that shows that his work reduces inflammation in the body, which helps the body in a variety of ways and helps you be more resistant to the cold weather and these kind of things, right? Whereas Grof's work, you don't have a breathing technique in holotropic breath work. There's no breathing technique. You're just encouraged to breathe aggressively. That's all. So you don't go like, 30 and then a 1 minute breath hold and all these kind of things. No, you just breathe how you want to breathe. There's music playing that might play into it. And then the whole point of that breathing is to get you in touch with a non-ordinary state. And then once you're in touch with that non-ordinary state, then you're just encouraged to go with it a little bit like a surfer. So the aggressive breathing is like swimming out on the surfboard to meet the wave. But once the wave arrives, you can forget about the breathing and you just focus on the wave, this kind of thing. And that's where the emotional expression, physical movement comes from, right? Because you're moving a lot and you're expressing yourself. Is that clear enough?
Yeah. No, I'm like fascinated. We talked very recently to Andre Gomez from the Qualia Research Institute, One of his major models is neural annealing. So sort of processes that heat up the mind and then cool down the mind, or heat up
Okay.
and then cool down. So a fun one of like going in a sauna and then going in an ice bath is like a heat up and then like cool down very quick. So I'm interested in like the ways in which some of your work might be doing that, you take people up into the breathing and then like cool them off in a
well, it's interesting you mentioned that, and my work doesn't really get into that, but I met a guy from Iceland who had bipolar disorder, and he was not medicated, and he used I believe he was using the Wim Hof method to keep his bipolar disorder in check. But I think the main thing he was doing was he was taking hot and then cold showers. First the hot, then the cold. First the hot, then the cold. And he described it as keeping the fire in the cauldron. Like, he recognized he still had the disorder, but the hot, cold showers were leading to, it was like a good coping strategy. It wasn't, I don't think he saw it as a healing strategy. So the work I'm doing is like a healing strategy, but I think that Wim Hof's work might potentially hold some keys for coping. Now why isn't it healing? Why isn't the Wim Hof stuff healing as opposed to coping? Because the focus is not on releasing trauma. And my work, the focus is really on releasing energies that are related to trauma in some way, whether you know it or not, whether you're aware of it or not.
So how does that work? You said it was somatic.
Somatic, meaning in the body, So to give you an idea, for my first client from 2013, she had a pain in her, she had been hospitalized 10 years in a row, about a month at a time in Romania. And she had a pain in her coccyx that was so bad that she couldn't lay on her back. She couldn't sit in a chair for more than 10 minutes without feeling uncomfortable. I had a similar experience with coccyx pain from a Kundalini awakening that had happened on a Vipassana meditation retreat a few years earlier, and it had cleared, but it came up from that. And I had to drive my car with a pillow on the car seat because my coccyx was bothered so much, right? But I knew it was related to the Kundalini process because that's what happened on this retreat, right? I didn't have this pain before. So she's there with her pain in her coccyx. I was like, you see, I think your disorder is related to this coccyx pain. Okay. So think about that for a second. You're going to go to a psychiatrist and you're going to say that a person's mental disorder is not in their brain. It's in their ass, right? The blockage in the coccyx right down there. Now, as it turned out, she had other blockages as well. She had a blockage in the throat, she had blockages in other places. But so that's what I mean by somatic. It's in the body, right? And so then when you do breath work, you're working through that. And in her case, in her fifth breathwork session, and her sessions were very short, like about 30 minutes each. But in her fifth session, she didn't move a muscle. She was just laying there. Hot energy came from the coccyx up the spine, into the shoulder blades, out through the hands, and her coccyx pain was gone after that. And she improved a lot psychologically as well. Her friends commented that her episodes were getting milder. She was more expressive and things like that. So it was a very important first step for her. And, she's done much better since then. So imagine, you were talking about mental disorder is found throughout the entire body. That's the way I see it. But mostly along the chakra line seems to be the most common places
chakra
that
line,
get
like the spine, like the nervous system.
Yeah,
channel.
Yeah. But those centers seem to carry a lot of energy. The heart, throat, really strong. Sometimes sexual energy, pineal gland right here. I had one guy I worked with who got up. He was a tough kid, Turkish kid who lived in Sweden. And he gets up and he goes, man, like my third eye is just firing off here and I don't even believe in this shit.
I'm super curious if you have any other patterns. So you've seen this pain in the coccyx. Are there any other patterns that you see? I mean, I guess you'd be building a theory about like what sort of energetic emotional blockages might lead someone to end up with a bipolar type disorder. Are you starting to patterns?
Yeah, people will talk about pain in the stomach, or in the solar plexus, like right below the heart. They'll say, "Oh, I feel like there's a blockage here, and this right, something needs to come through." So it's just like the bulk of the really and most of the powerful breakthrough kind of stuff happens with the heart. A lot of stuff, like you just have what feels like volcanic explosions of the heart, and one of the most beautiful things about the work is in certain cases, in certain situations, you can actually see people's eyes change. They become brighter and more engaging after the work. And when you see that, somebody's had a hell of a healing process, can be a beautiful thing. So clearly the work to me is bioenergetic. And until more people start to see that, we're lost. I mean, it's just going to be medication. And this, one of the things I think that is complicated is that we live in a world right now, I would say, where it's like there's two big perspectives, we'll say. There's the medical perspective, which comes from sort of a modern materialistic paradigm where there's no spirituality, that doesn't really exist, right? That's the one. And then there's this postmodern world, which is going, well, wait a second, but there's other ways to look at things, and there's other cultures, and what about diversity? And well, look at how, these tribes are dealing with certain things, and very exploratory, right? And that's great. But if you're actually going to help somebody and you've got a compressed period of time and they're spending money to get healing, you can't be dilly-dallying with like, well, let's try this eagle feather and let's pray to this god, or let's go to the stars, or you have to have a focus, right? And so I think part of the reason that the Grof holotropic breathwork work hasn't really taken off, it's growing, but it hasn't really taken off, and my work hasn't taken off, is because it's very direct, like it's very focused. It's like, this is where you need to go. You might not need to go there with holotropic breathwork, bipolar breathwork, like what I'm doing. There can be other ways to release energy blockages in our bioenergetic system, but there needs to be the recognition that, hey, you're working on a bioenergetic system. There's traumas held in there in bioenergetic blockages, and in order to heal, you need to work through those blockages. Some people would say, oh, that's so dogmatic. Where's the diversity? Where are the other perspectives? It doesn't have to be that way. No, it has to be that way, motherfucker. You have to get through those blockages. If you don't, you're wasting people's time and money. You're wasting people's time and money. So it's not a diverse perspective, not a diverse perspective. And
it's a focused one.
Yeah, it's focused. And that pisses people off these days, because everybody wants everything diversity and everybody's got the perspective and all that stuff. And I'm just like, no, there's a lot of ways that people can go that completely waste their time, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. I do think, like, just to like comment on the diversity thing, I think like when you're developing this, like you're developing like a worldview, which the next generations come along and be like, oh, look at all the diversity. We've got the, bipolar, holotropic, we've got the eagle feather, we've got all these things. And then you kind of just become like one of the things that the next generation, gets to visit and gets to experience as diverse. But like when you're within your space, I think you got to be your space. You got to do your thing.
Yeah, you've got to pick a lane, right? Like you've got to do your thing. You just can't have all these other things coming. And one of the big things, though, is that people will eventually figure out that an approach similar to what I'm doing, I'm not saying I've got the perfect approach, but similar along those principles, of unblocking traumatic energies. That's what it's about. And all these other perspectives, they're nice, but they're not taking you very far. That's my opinion. Like if you're, oh, well, my guru said that this was because I was a criminal in a past life. congratulations. That insight is not going to do a fucking thing for your disorder. Nothing. And if anything, it could make it worse.
Unless
then
you've got doing something about it.
Now you have to deal with
like
this.
apologizing.
No, even if you're doing something about it, even if you're dealing, oh, I was a criminal in a past life. Okay, that's what I need to work on. Total waste of time. Total waste of time. It's
okay, sorry. So you're saying something stronger than what I originally thought you were saying. You're
yeah.
saying like this is how bipolar is cured. Like either you're going the medication route or you're fixing, like you're going through the blockages and you're working through that.
Yeah, for the most part. Now you can get through those blockages sometimes in a sort of accidental way almost, Right. So for example, sometimes when people channel spirits, they do that a lot here in Brazil. People go into these non-ordinary states and some healing can happen there, but it's sort of incidental, and it's within a Christian, African Christian Indian orientation, and the priests or the people running the show, they don't really know exactly what's going on sometimes, So I've seen, for example, a shamanic workshop I was at years ago. It was more of a new age shamanism, it was based on Native American traditions. And there was a woman there who collapsed and went into a birth process, extremely psychologically sensitive process that the shamanic leaders really didn't know what they were doing with, they put her aside. They didn't worry about it. They left her in a room, but they didn't understand the level of psychological vulnerability she was at, like what she was dealing with, So it's, yeah. So I guess what I'm saying is we need a new model, and a model that's good, not just, well, you can pick your own model. You can pick your own model. A lot of people with bipolar disorder will say in the peer support movement will be like, well, I'm going to heal me. I'm like, probably not. You're not going to heal yourself. I'm my own doctor. Nah, you're probably not your own doctor. You think you are, but you're not your own doctor. Sorry. I have a little bit of contempt for the peer support movement sometimes, although I'm very supportive of, I think it's a good movement.
I would be worried for any system. So I have a special rant for like labels. So Western medical, Western psychological systems, we get beautiful labels like ADHD, like autism, and there's a way in which the labels are really, if you don't know what you have and you stumble into like, oh, there's this description of a person who has ADHD and it fits me almost perfectly. That's like very, very exciting. And it's a stepping stone forward. Like, finally, I know what I have. It's the ADHD thing. Turns out the quality of, I can't get myself to do things I don't want to do. Right. That's the like, oh, finally, I have a label for that. And then I have this frustration that people stop on the label. They're like, okay, I have the don't want to do that disorder. And then I can't move on from here. And what we really need is the stepping stone beyond that. Okay, now that I realize there are things I don't want to do, I need to make it workable so I can still pay my bills and fit in with society. The like step forward from here is the development of executive function that makes it possible to integrate the like looking at the underlying traumas that cause that distraction, frustration problem, so that you can unlock it and free up your psyche to be able to do other things. The label's only a stepping stone, but I get frustrated about peer support that is like, we both have bipolar, we're going to have bipolar forever, we're going to just like be miserable here about our bipolars forever. There's not as much like movement, momentum out of that label as I would like to see.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, in a postmodern United States kind of thing, there's a lot of talk about like neurodiversity. And I got a good friend of mine on the West Coast, Josh Roberts, I think his name is Josh. But, he does the whole thing on neurodiversity. And I think there is some benefit to that perspective. But if you think that your disorder is like, well, this is who I am, I'm neurodiverse, and that's where it stops. It's like, dude, your life could be a lot better if you took on more of a healing paradigm, and in the idea that not just people with bipolar disorder, but everybody needs to heal. Everybody's traumatized to some degree. We could all heal and grow and develop. And I work on my own, using my own approaches. I work on myself, regularly. Like, stuff will come up for me once a week. right?
Do you have a regular practice that you do to
Somewhat,
journal?
and it's evolving to a certain degree, but I have something I call like, first, I do healing for people at a distance too, but one of the things that I recognized was that some of those people were having emotions come up they didn't know how to deal with. And then I realized, oh, so their emotions are becoming conscious instead of unconscious, right? So maybe I could teach them that. And so I have a technique called conscious emotional clearing, and I use it for myself. And it actually developed out of my own process with my own therapist, because we would be talking about stuff, and then the talking would actually get me activated. So I would end up feeling worse halfway through therapy than I was in the beginning, you know? It's like, well, let me tell you what about happened yesterday. And then 20 minutes later, I'm like, like this kind of thing.
You're reliving that.
Yeah. It's like you open the box of energy there. Right. And then she'd say, well, what do you want to do? And then it's like my breathwork techniques sort of came in, because, we're trained to be very somatically expressive. And so then I would start vocalizing a lot. So for example, if I was feeling sad, I would like center myself on where the center of that sadness might be, for example, at the heart. And then it would be like the sadness. I would just give an authentic feeling of what that sadness was like, in long primal tones, like, and then that might come with physical movement. For example, anxiety might be a higher tone and be something like, and then you can bring in, if it's relationship oriented, you could bring in uncensored speech too. So like you can imagine somebody in front of you that this is dealing with, like you're looking at your mother or a guy at work or something, and you could just start to be like, similar to the screaming thing, but just unload the language that you would say to that person if you weren't afraid of losing that relationship, and just be like, how could you be doing this to me? I hate your guts. I want to kill you, like this kind of thing. And continuing with that until the energy goes to a peaceful place. So you check in with that energy, and then it's like, well, how do you feel there now? And what you'll notice is that energy does tend to come from different locations in the body, tends to be along the chakra line for the most part, and the energies will move. So you might feel anger at the heart, which might turn into sadness at the throat, but then things can shift into a place of peace, like really peaceful. And then, you're done. The healing field has given you like a wall, a layer of energy to work through. And then you get to a place where you're just like, wow, I feel so much better, and that's like, that it might take 10 minutes, it might take 90 minutes, but it's really amazing. I find what you can do when you're conscious about working through your negative emotions,
I feel like I'm about to just like swap tricks of the trade. So I work with people with emotions as well, and often I'm meeting people who are afraid of their own anger. They're uncomfortable about their own fear. They don't like expressing sadness, and I'll be like, all right, well, let's just go there. Let's just make you angry right now. Like, what are the things that you can, like, imagine playing a story in your head of like something that makes you angry. Think of a memory that makes you angry, and let's just meet your anger. And, it comes into the body, it moves, it heats up, it agitates, it does the things that anger usually does. But instead of being out in the wild and bumping into it and like finding yourself angry, like something triggers you and you find yourself angry, the deliberate process of like calling it up and inviting it has a very different relationship, because you're like, I brought this here so I could study it. Let me get to know my anger. And that completely transforms someone's relationship to their own emotions. And then they're able to be like, oh, this is what my anger is. It's me being protective. It's me being assertive. It's me being powerful. Like, I want access to my own anger so that I can embody things in the world that I want to bring out. And that's over and over. I am constantly surprised by more and more people going through that and finding wonderful and amazing transformation in meeting their own emotions.
No, that's great. It's great. I remember there was a woman I met at my certification, Grof certification, and she was from Australia, grew up in the outback. And she said, all my life, I was a good and proper woman. And at 55, I went to my first holotropic breathwork workshop. And within 20 minutes, I had 6 facilitators on top of me, and I wanted to rip out their throats and drink their blood.
That'll take any psychologist off the map. It's just like,
Yeah.
I guess this is new.
Yeah. And then she said that her children, and then after that, she was more angry around the family because she sort of unlocked this, took the genie out of the bottle. And her kids said that they preferred her angry, or at least showing anger, because they felt like they had more of a real mother.
There's some honesty in emotions. Like,
the hot truth.
Tell us what we care about. Like, and if they're out, it's like, oh yeah, this is it. We talk about differences between men and women, like as kids on the playground. When a boy hits you, he hits you. You're like, you actually feel it. When a girl like insults you, because they have greater verbal emotional intelligence than they do physical strength. Wow. You don't know if that punch is coming today or 10 years from now. Like you don't know. Like it's like, right? It's potentially psychologically damaging in a way that physical violence, at least you felt it when you felt it.
Yeah, you know where it came from. It's not like lingering back there in your psyche for decades.
Right. I mean, like my grandma went to her grave with resentments. She's like, I'm taking this to my grave. Like, because she didn't express it. That's like cultural, of course. But, seeing when I see someone is angry, I'm like, thank God they're not holding it back and denying and like ready to attack me later, or they're going to talk to me about me behind my back. It's just here. I'm like, great, show me, let's talk about it. Like, bring that up. Yeah. I'm so glad to see it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm glad to see the full version of yourself with the anger.
Yeah. And I was always afraid to show my anger when I was a kid. And then with my wife, who's a transpersonal psychologist too, she sees my anger in a much more direct way. And she's pretty good about dealing with it. It's like she's present, she doesn't run from the emotion. She's present to the whole thing.
That's really beautiful. That's awesome.
We do our best.
So
does your t-shirt say dad, Daniel?
Yeah.
Does it say dad?
I'm the
dad. All right, Dad.
I don't know if you saw his kid sort of pop in and say hi.
I did.
Oh, that's good. About an hour ago. This was like a very quick moment.
Right. It's good to have that t-shirt so your kids know who you are, right? I mean, they don't get confused.
Because I'm like pretty like free range. So if I go to a party, the kids just like wandering around doing, hanging out with everyone. And so like I have the shirt and then everyone knows that I'm the dad. And
they remember who to go home with. Okay, we don't go home with that guy. Hate to think what would happen if you put that t-shirt on somebody else. Anyways.
So I'm curious about your therapeutic frame. So if you look at a therapy like Gestalt therapy, they talk about the Gestalt being a way of being, that they're holding themselves in a therapeutic container as they relate to their clients. They are inviting their clients into their frame, into their therapeutic container. But a Gestalt therapist, if you meet them, they're like a thing. They're like, the Gestalt is like alive and traveling with them. They are the Gestalt as it walks through the world. And
it doesn't stop, right? It doesn't stop.
It never stops. It's like a living practice.
Never take a break.
They train other Gestaltists by inviting them into the frame and to like, this is the Gestalt that you're invited into, which is a fascinating, powerful technique. My curiosity with you is, do you turn off your frame? Do you like you live with another transpersonal psychologist? You don't exactly like, it's not like home life is different to like live on stage life. Do you turn it off, or do you feel like you can step out of the healing field that exists, or it's always there?
Well, I actually did a retreat with a Gestalt therapist once. And one of the first things he told me, he said, Gestalt is a way of life, And I noticed that he never, I said to him at one point, I said, do you ever stop being a therapist? he was like, I'm not being a therapist right now. No. It was like, he just didn't stop being a therapist. I'm
I'm
a
not.
little bit.
I have this open curiosity. Is it a good way to be, to permanently be the in the frame in the therapist, or is it like, along with this question of like, do you ever turn yours off?
Yeah. I, for a long time, had a hard time with the word therapist because I didn't really see what I was doing as being a therapist, being a therapist sort of implies being more like kind of like a psychologist for some people. And then part of what I do is like, there's a lot of shamanism or like a shamanic orientation because I'm working with energy, in a quantum field. So, but I didn't want people to think that I was a guru or anything like that. So that was part of it. And then the first thing I tell people when they come on my retreats is I was in the hospital. So the only difference between me and you is I've done more work than you have, So the work is a little bit like being a coach, like training people how to do what I've learned how to do, When people say to me, oh, I want to do what you do, I say, well, the first thing you have to do is work on your own healing. And then that's the last time I hear from them because they want to help other people. They don't want to help themselves, So yes. I'm working on myself a lot. I do a lot of self-work. So I think of my own frame as just being Sean, like just as being the real me as I can possibly be. And I work from there. So I think I don't think I take on a framework that isn't me, and sometimes maybe I should, like there are some moments where I should have certain boundaries, where certain like most therapists would be like, okay, you're the client, I'm the therapist, but I share a lot of my life. I share my hospitalizations. I go for drinks with my clients. Sometimes I've gone for drinks with my clients on retreats. We had one guy who just wasn't expressing anything. We took him out for some beers, Some of my clients are my best friends now online and stuff. We've had long relationships with clients that, they're my friends now. And then we do the work together. So my style is very fluid, and then I've asked, like, when I've gone into non-ordinary states to help clients, I'll ask clients to support me. So then like our roles reverse, right? And I might end up going through my own personal stuff because you don't know what's going to come up in the holotropic field, right? But if I'm having particular issues, I might end up on the mat on a retreat for another client, and I'm the one crying, So that doesn't make any sense in a therapeutic standpoint. So it's really broken down, And the time I asked because one of the things that happens is I absorb the energies of my clients. That's something we don't have time to get into really a whole lot. But that means I need to do breath work for my clients. Okay, that happens. And the Gestalt therapist, he just couldn't even be in the room. I mean, it was just too much for him. I had to get supported by somebody else because it just didn't fit their paradigm. So I think there's I don't know a whole lot about Gestalt therapy. Seems like there's a fair amount of good there, but it's a pretty limited framework compared to what I'm working with. I mean, Grof's work is just mind-blowing, compared to anything else in psychology from what I've seen.
Incredible.
Yeah.
I'm like juggling bits and pieces here. Like, okay, that's where that fits. So that's where Sean fits. I think that there's a lot of these days, hopefully in therapy, there's an invitation to become your own type of therapist, much as you might get taught techniques. I'm not a therapist, but
yeah, it depends on the country. It depends on the country, but maybe in Australia it is. Yeah.
Do you call yourself kind of a healer? Do you have a word? You're like, you're still battling with the words. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, I'm pretty uncomfortable with everything, I kind of shrug and say I'm a therapist. I like to tell people that I'm a certified holotropic breathwork facilitator because that's something I actually have a diploma in, and I believe in that work and I think is important. But usually they don't know what that means, right? And the work is really shamanic. But we don't really have a very good word for kind of like non-cultural shamanism that I'm doing. Like, I'm not bringing in any eagle feathers or anything like that. I'm not doing any rituals. It's like actually on my retreats, my approach is very stripped down. So like, I don't bring in any, even though it's spiritual work, I don't bring in any prayers. I don't bring in any gods. It's very sort of Zen, like, just, I don't bring in anything, you know.
I think back to things like Feldenkrais, the Alexander technique, going back 30, 50 years. This was their method, and they named it after themselves. They went, it's the Alexander technique, it's the Sean technique. And like today we work within a field of knowledge that has slightly been developed. We had Freud, we had Jung, we had all these people. We even had Eric Byrne, games people play, and transactional analysis. Like, he developed a field there. We've got transpersonal psychology. These fields are developed, and I still want to see space for the next Alexander, the next Sean, the next person bringing their own new paradigm, naming it after themselves, and being like, hey, can I teach more people this cool way of being, or this cool method that really helps with people's stuff? I wish there were a little bit more space in the field, not for quacks who have a shitty technique that are like not actually helping people, but for genuinely helping people, like, hey, let's get to the stuff, let's work through it.
Yeah, well, that's cool, because I'm the same way. And I had I've said to people at some conferences and training, I've said, who do you see as the next Stan Grof? People are big followers of Grof. It's blank, and Stan Grof is 93 years old. Isn't there anybody out there who like has transcended his work? And I'll be honest, I'm the only one I've found. To tell you the truth. But in terms of Grof's work, I mean, there's places where I know I've surpassed his work. I know that, from working with people, because no one has ever worked with people with disorders using breath work for 10 days straight. I'm the only one. That has never been done before. And so doing that, you learn a lot. It's a new thing. And I've actually had a couple of people tell me, like, you're the next Stan Grof kind of thing. Like Grof trained facilitator telling me I'm the next Stan Grof. And I was like, whoa, like, really? And she's like, I think that's obvious, because nobody was doing what I was doing. So I know it sounds like I'm tooting my own horn and everything, but I go to conferences and stuff, and I'm just like, these people, everybody's in the 60s still. Like, the vast majority of stuff you hear at sort of leading edge conferences is still stuck in the 1960s.
I wish a couple more people would toot their own horns. Like,
I'm a little embarrassed.
A really interesting world if we saw that. And obviously, once you toot your horn, you're required to back that up, right?
Sure, I can back it up. That's not a problem.
Right, but that's the thing. That's the exciting potential, that you believe you can do it, and I have no doubt that you can do it. Like, great.
Thanks, Eliot.
To your own horn, like, then change the paradigm of psychology that we live in. Help people. It's going to be amazing.
There's a few areas that I think have a lot of potential for growth too, that I'm not specialized in, just so I don't toot just my own horn. But there are other spiritual therapies, like internal family systems. Have you ever heard of that one?
I'm a big fan of that one.
Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah. I like that one. I'm not trained in it, but I think it's got a lot of potential to help people. It can help people who are not ready for my work, because it helps them deal with like protector, like voices and things like this inside themselves. Right. And then the other one is family constellation therapy.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Been getting really excited and done a few family actually did one in my home. I had like 8 people over, and we had dinner, and then we got late, and we were talking about someone's family of origin, and that they were like a little bit separate from, and then we were like, yeah, let's just try a family constellation. And we did. And we pulled every person, the 8 of us, and we, stood. I don't know if you know how family constellations go.
I do. Yeah.
So we stood.
I participated in them.
We're like, well, how do you feel about that person? How do you feel? And we said a couple of things. The person said to their parent, like, hey, like, why don't you love me, or something? And the parent said, I'm sorry, I just can't, from where the way that I see it. The person playing their role said, like, I just can't change. And the person, that was a like incredible therapeutic moment. The person received that message from their like parent type person. And we did like, this is in my house. We're just mucking around doing some family constellations. They're incredibly powerful.
See, and I think we need more guys like you, Eliot, and Daniel. I don't know if you're the same, but Eliot's just bringing his friends over and just fucking around. Let's see what we can do here. And I think there's a lot of people who are kind of like you, who are out there and willing to sort of experiment and take chances and not worry about being perfect. You don't have to have a credential on the wall, and just try and work these things through. And like one of the things that I do a form of breath work at a distance for people, because I realized I was absorbing energies from clients when I was working with them. And it turned out that was non-local. So I have a thing I call distance surrogate breath work, where I'm breathing on behalf of a client. And then how that works is I'll lay down and do a form of breath work where I'm vocalizing and moving around and expressing. And then I'll have visions, physical sensations, and maybe dreams afterwards that are related to the client. Like, so if Eliot's my client, I'll have dreams and visions and sensations related to Eliot. And when I tell him that, he'll know that I'm working on his material. See, so it's like a special key between us that we know that work happened. But I got there mainly because I was looking at family constellation therapy. And I was like, wow, we've got volunteers here who are clearly accessing the souls.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're accessing the souls of people who are not in the room and are not giving permission, right? So I was like, that looks quantum to me. So maybe what I'm doing is quantum too, And that's how I figured that out.
One thing I think about is sort of the phrase access to spirit, where if you go back several hundred years, we had the tribal system, the shaman had access to the spirit. And then you had these organized religions that tried to create a systematized access to spirit that then, at an attempt to democratize access to spirit, then became a like monopolizing of access to spirit. And then we had the 60s and the 70s and the New Age revolution, where a whole bunch of new people were taking on like, hey, I can access spirit, try it like this. And I see this like maybe some of my work is like anyone can do it, like re-access.
Yeah.
Like grand religion's very helpful, very organized, and also like just go for it yourself. You should have a connection to God if that's what you're calling it. You should have the thing. Like I want everyone to have their own access to spirit. It should be non-denominational. It should be multiplicative. It should be everyone should have their own wisdom.
Yeah.
Like
make your own religion.
Well, you don't need to train in
a religion that is a religion
certificate to be able to have access. You don't need to study
to
have access. You should have access.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things about breath work is that the only reason you're breathing is to give you access. Okay. So you're in a safe setting, you're breathing, you get the access. But once you do it a lot, like if you've had a lot of sessions like I've had, you don't need to breathe very much because you know kind of where you're going. So I just see myself as having access pretty much at will. I'm not in some wild visual state, but I can feel, I know what I'm feeling for, and it can take me to powerful places.
I did a sort of pseudo holotropic process, and this one time, and I have the most profound part of that experience was that it didn't quite end. I was in a thing, I was experiencing an altered state, I was like whatever, and then the time was ending and we sort of trailed off, and there was no like, if you're drunk you're like, oh, I'm a bit tipsy, and then like you sober up, you're like, okay, I'm sober now, right? There was no difference between the altered, between the spiritual, between the profound experience and the everyday experience. And that left me with the like, oh, even right now, I'm still having that experience. I am still having an experience. And that left me with like, oh, access is just always, like spirit is always here in some fascinating sense.
Sure, it's always there.
I'd love to get everyone to like, oh, I'm having an experience right now.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing that people don't really get yet, like even me, like in you reading my book, I needed to go to Peru There was something there at Machu Picchu for me. It was like a calling, you know, but it was like my regular daily life. Well, that wasn't really a spiritual thing, but going to Peru, wow, the spirituality is really on Machu Picchu, you know, it's powerful and things like that. But then you get to a place where you realize that, you know, spirit's with us all the time. It's everywhere. It's normal, right? It's here on this call, right? And we don't really get that yet, because that implies that there's a higher intelligence paying attention to what we're doing, kind of like Santa Claus. and that's unnerving to people. And for other people, it sounds very dogmatic. But if you're working with that energy on a regular basis, it's just as obvious as, well, there's a table in front of me, you know, or I'm on a Zoom call. It's very tangible, you know.